Hello and welcome to the Karate Priest Podcast. I'm your host, Father Daniel Duplantis. I'm a martial artist, musician, airman, and a priest of the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. One of my other passions in life is teaching, especially teaching about the Catholic faith. Catholicism is a very deep faith. Jesus himself told Peter to put out into the deep for a catch. The most significant answers to life's most important questions often lie deep beneath the surface. Many people have questions about their faith. Through this podcast, my aim is to explore these questions and encounter incredible people along the way. Their stories show that God is constantly at work in our lives every single day, sometimes in the ordinary and sometimes in the extraordinary. Some of the topics treated in this podcast may be sensitive or controversial, but their discussion holds the key to truly living as God created us to live, which is to say that He created us to live in authentic freedom, loving Him above all else. Thank you for joining me on this journey of faith, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. Hey guys, and welcome back to the Karate Priest Podcast. I am your host, Father Daniel Duplantis, and today I have with me some familiar guests. We have Todd Fischer, my producer, and Amber, the religious hippie. And so her podcast is also produced by Todd. And so, guys, it's great to have you all back on the podcast.
Hey, Father
having
Dan.
me. I appreciate it.
Hey.
Hey.
Yep.
Amber was a surprise guest today. I texted her while we were waiting to get on, and I said, "Hey, are you doing anything? Do you want to come by and make a surprise appearance?"
I was literally trying to surprise Father Dan, so I changed my name on Zoom to LOL instead of Amber, so he wouldn't notice. But then I'm like, dang it, my room's the exact same, so he's gonna know. But you know what? I tried.
That's exactly the first thing I noticed. I was like, wait, I've seen this room before on Zoom. I was like, this is Amber. I was like, where is she?
You should have put one of those green screen backgrounds up so it just looked like a space field or a jungle or something.
Honestly, I could have been in a jungle, guys, and Father Dan would have never known.
I didn't even notice LOL, but anywho, no, I'm really excited about this episode today because we're going to be talking a little bit about like a Catholic perspective on various types of media. And Todd and Amber, you both bring some really unique experiences with this. Todd, especially because of your background working with various media, with documentaries, TV shows, things of that nature. And Amber, with your huge presence on social media, YouTube and a lot of your content as well has been geared towards Catholic media, with how do we look at things and, maybe things that, you've been very open and vulnerable with on things you've regretted watching or just will not watch again in the future,
Right.
So we're going to talk a little bit about these kind of things today. So how about with that, Amber, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about your experience, as you've come through your conversion, really, about how you've come to see things that different types of media you've encountered in the past, how you see them now.
Yeah, so when I was a teenager, that's basically when most of the social media started coming out. I remember when YouTube first became a big thing. I remember when Instagram had its old logo, which was basically a brown box with something. I don't know. Everything was super, super new when it came to social media when I was a teenager. So I was basically up and coming with social media. I think one of the first things that I noticed was before I came into my faith, it was a way for me to connect with my friends. It was a way for me to share my life with my relatives who lived, across the state. But as it started taking off a lot more and more celebrities got involved in it, it really became a kind of a struggle for me to control it and not let it overtake my life, in the sense of having limits. I wasn't able to give myself limits, and it actually became an addiction. And I think it's interesting because I can say for a fact that most, if not all of us, are addicted to our phones, but because all of us are addicted to our phones, nobody thinks it's an actual addiction. However, if one person in the world was addicted to their phone, everyone would be like, oh my gosh, this person's sick, they need help. But because we're all addicted, nobody thinks we need help. So it's kind of that interesting kind of parallel. But when I came back into my faith, I did notice quite a change in the fact that I realized I needed to limit it because God should be my focus and I should be spending more time with God than I should be on social media. Easier said than done, of course, because our phones are on us 24/7, and it's kind of hard to do that. So I make a point when I go into church or something to leave my phone in the car, unless I'm specifically there to take pictures or something afterwards. But yeah, I've noticed a great change in the people that I follow on social media. I used to follow models all the time and celebrities, and for the most part, I follow some still that I think are, really cool and I like to keep up with, but I don't idolize them or think of them as like role models at all. I just kind of keep up with them, but I definitely follow a lot more Catholic influencers now and pro-life influencers.
Cool stuff. Yeah. And Todd, like this is really kind of your domain in terms of like your professional work. You've been involved with various kinds of media for a very long time. So can you explain to the listeners like your background with everything that you've done with like, television and your books and things like that?
Sorry, I was distracted. I was on my iPad. Entertainment is what I call my first career. I'm on my second career now in my spiritual path. But I worked in film and television for many years. And I have a real love-hate relationship with it now, looking back on it, looking at that compartmentalized part of my life. Yeah. Rethinking, well, for one, they were all a series of temp jobs, right? So you have this odd idea of, you see people with jobs they work at for 20 years. And then I look at these jobs where I had for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or a couple of years at the most. So all of these temp jobs, it's sort of it kind of messes with you after a while, that you wonder if you've wasted your time on a bunch of temp jobs or shows that might have been popular at one point that now no one even remembers, So it's really odd to look back at that history of those things, but also the content of those things. And I think really what I wanted to get out of this conversation today was, if there are dangers in secular entertainment, and I thought maybe we would run some of the genres and you could, say what you think, because I think probably the most problematic might be things like horror and fantasy, or, films that depict drug use or profanity or sex or nudity. From the Catholic's perspective, these aren't movies that people should watch, right? I mean, how do you police that? Is it policed in the home? Do we just abide by the rating systems? Kick that off about the dangers of these types of movies, these genres.
Yeah, and I think to maybe kind of get a starting point, because this is a very wide-ranging topic. This is something that I've really been concerned about probably since I started in the seminary. Just with like, as we start seeing like new types of social media come out, because things like Instagram, Snapchat really kind of came out when I was in high school. And one of the things that, I started noticing was like there's a wide range of content on these platforms as well. And like the whole idea behind Snapchat, if I'm not mistaken, it was designed to be a sexting app. The whole concept of like you can send a picture to someone and it in a sense goes away, which is always like a digital footprint. Yeah, Amber probably has done a lot of research into this. Yep. And I remember, just, like talking to high schools as a seminarian and kind of bringing that point up. And so that always kind of kickstarted for me this kind of thought of like keeping an eye out on what's out there, especially because a lot of my ministry as a parish priest is family ministry, is helping parents to realize what's out there that might be going under their radar, and what their children are being fed and what the parents might not know, especially with the generational gap in the technology gap, because kids are growing up with technology these days. And I think for some parents, they're kind of maybe lost as to, what's out there. How are their kids accessing this? How can they put controls on there if they don't even know how to access the technology themselves and their kids do? So that's kind of like the perspective I come out with a lot of these things. And so in terms of like, like genres and stuff, this is where things can kind of really get dicey. There's a lot of content. I think a lot of any discussion we have about like genres and, what to watch, what not to watch, requires discernment and discretion. I think those really kind of go hand in hand. is being able to take things with a grain of salt. And like, for example, a recent example is the new Father Stu movie with Mark Wahlberg. I've actually yet to see it, but I've heard great things about it. Also, there's a lot of disclaimers on social media saying that it's got curse words in there, but that's because they're depicting the real life Father Stu. And before his conversion, that's what he did, and so with that, I think we have to like take things with a grain of salt. We can't just pretend that like things like this don't happen in the world. But at the same time, there's a limit when it comes to like glorifying certain things. And I think that's where, especially as a parent, or even just, once you get old enough to really discern for yourself what to watch and what not to watch, you really have to come at it with that sense of, is this perhaps, this behavior being glorified? And if it is, then that's probably where we need to say, I really probably shouldn't be feeding this to my soul. But at the same time, it is good to be aware of certain evils in the world. Like that's how we build a moral compass, is by knowing the difference between good and evil. And so that's the thing, there's going to be a lot of gray area, I think, with a lot of these genres and just with a lot of the finer points. And so I'm hoping maybe, as best as possible with this episode, maybe to kind of help maybe refine that line a little bit clearer. So Todd, if you have any like specific questions or genres, you want to jump into.
Horror almost always includes a significant amount of violence.
Right.
Wait. Okay.
Oh,
yes.
Amber, let's go for it. Yeah.
Yes, but I was a horror fanatic as a teenager. Fanatic. And I told you, Todd, I was obsessed with the Scream TV series on, what was that channel? BBC or something? I don't know, whatever. BBC. Anyways, I will say that there are some horror movies where, as a Catholic now, I can look back and be like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have watched that. Like it was super involved in the occult, or like it was super demonic and things like that. But then there were other horror movies I would watch, like The Exorcist, or some Catholic-based horror movies that weren't glorifying evil and portrayed it as evil is, where I'm like, okay, well, it's not glorifying evil. Should we still be watching that though? I mean, that's, again, is it going to cause scandal to your soul? Is it going to cause problems? Is it going to cause you to lose sleep because you're scared of it, So again, you have to discern that for yourself and what your tolerant level is. But I know for me, like some of it actually helped me in my faith in certain senses, being like, wow, obviously it's not going to be the same as an actual exorcist because we're not allowed to film those, exorcisms. But I think it kind of gives into the power of God and how it overcomes evil in the end, even the darkest, Yeah,
I definitely want to piggyback that because I think you make a really good distinction. The difference between like, something that is glorifying, violence or just like, different like occult practices. And so like there's been certain horror films that I've seen that I'm like, man, I really don't like how something is portrayed. And but at the same time, like under that genre, there are movies like The Right, like the RITE, The Right, which is about it's based on a true story. There's a lot of Hollywood liberties, but it's based on a real exorcist from the United States who did his kind of exorcist interning in Rome. It's great movie. Actually kind of really gave me my first awareness of what exorcism is. So that's the thing with like The Right is, it's a real portrayal of the movie and a real portrayal of exorcism. And it really kind of sparked that interest for me. One, like in priesthood, in the sense of spiritual warfare, it presented a very real issue that people face every single day. And that's demonic activity. And then, from there, I actually got to meet the priest. He came to our seminary and got to explain about like the liberties that were taken with the movie, but to explain that there's a book that was written that's really like the true story. And so that's a movie that I think really kind of portrays, that horror genre in a more formative way. The Exorcism of Emily Rose is actually a very good one also. And from what I'm told, the consensus among most exorcists is that movie is probably the best Hollywood portrayal of exorcism. And so that one, there's a lot that goes into it. And I've seen that movie and it really kind of goes into like the different types of activity. And then even to like present like the legal side of, what happens when someone dies of exorcism and it goes to court, and the priest is defending everything that the church is saying and defending his ministry. Whereas, in the eyes of the state, somebody died as a result of this. And so they have to investigate,
Right. And I'm pretty sure insurance doesn't cover that.
Right. And so that's you bring up a good point, Amber, with that kind of the different types of horror films that there are that, I guess in some ways we're intrigued by horror genres. But at the same time, like it's films like I said, The Rite and the Exorcism of Emily Rose that really kind of, portray and can actually help form our consciences to realize the reality of the battle of good and evil.
Well, there was that other. Sorry, go ahead, Todd. Sorry.
You mentioned the portrayal of exorcisms, but I don't hear you talking about the portrayal of priests, which we see plenty of in movies. What do you think about the portrayal of priests?
Is a priest, so that is when I say exorcist.
Well, but generally, when you see whether it's a priest in Godfather 3 or a priest in a horror film, what do you think about the portrayal of priests in general that Hollywood does?
I mean, I find it could be hit or miss. I find that there's some really cheesy examples. Like, for example, I think it's one of the Conjuring movies where, they have a priest who comes in and locks up the Annabelle doll, which is like, okay, you would never do that anyway. Like occult items you would actually burn. So some of it is completely fictitious. Some of it you can tell they're almost like knocking the priesthood because of like the sex scandals and things like that. Other places I've been pleasantly surprised at the portrayal of the priesthood. One example that has always stuck out to me is the portrayal of the character Father Mulcahy in MASH. I'm a huge fan of MASH, and it was on Netflix a few years ago. And actually, it was watching MASH when I was in high school. That's the thing. It was always reruns because I was born in '94, and the last season of MASH came out, I think, in '83. So for me, like to watch these reruns, that was what inspired me to become a military chaplain. Was the portrayal of a priest that well in that environment, and so I've always really appreciated, at least from like a direction standpoint and a production standpoint, the way that Father Mulcahy was portrayed, because it was actually, I think, a very good example of priesthood, and even like a priest who you could see has like his personal struggles with what's going on around him with the war. But I love Father Mulcahy because he was a boxer. In a sense, he did martial arts. He was a military martial arts priest, and that's like, wait, that's what I am now, so you can see like how that like inspired me to continue doing these things that I do now. So that's the thing. I find that, in Hollywood, portrayal of priesthood is very much hit or miss. There's some really good examples. There's some really bad examples. So everything has to be taken with a grain of salt.
Someone asked me once, asked me this, and I thought this was a thought-provoking kind of question, is watching a sin a sin?
What you mean by that? Can you clarify that question a little bit more?
Well, if you're watching a movie that promotes drug use, profanity, sex, nudity, is watching a sin like that a sin, or is everyone just aware we're watching fiction?
I think it also depends, because as Catholics, we obviously know like bank robbery would be bad, right? So we're not going to go out and rob a bank, but I think there's some culpability of the people who put out the movie, in a sense. I don't know if you would agree with that, Father Dan.
I think for me, a lot of it has to do again with that like discernment of, is this glorifying the sin? Because obviously with things like biopics and stuff, people have real struggles. And like, so for example, and this is something as we were preparing for this episode, I was thinking of earlier today of, things like what would be like not okay in terms of like showing sin or like presenting sin through these different media. And I was thinking of things like 50 Shades of Grey. Never read it before, but I've heard enough about it to where I'm like, okay, to me, like this is not okay. Because this is essentially pornographic literature. And so like it's very like open. And this is something, especially when it comes to things like sexuality, for example. This is one I think where the church is probably a little bit more clear on this is not good, like pretty much never to show like in movies. And that's because it's something that is so sacred. And I think we forget that. I think in terms of like the portrayal of sexuality in media, it is something so sacred, and yet it's something that's become so much of a preoccupation for a lot of people, and at the same time is almost idol in itself. Like I think people idolize sex so much to the point where it controls so much, and so that's why even like in movies and books, anything that would be considered like a portrayal of like sex acts themselves, I really think needs to be left out. I really, really do. I don't think that you need to have like sex scenes in movies or even like in books. Like 50 Shades of Grey, like I'm sorry, but to me that's like, don't go there. Don't ever go there. Amber, you have any comments on especially like, stuff like that?
I mean, I completely agree. I remember when 50 Shades of Grey originally came out, and like anyone who could go went to go see it. And I was like, why? Like, what's the point? And there were so many, I think it was originally a book, right?
Yeah.
There was a lot of movies like that. And I think that's the thing. It's like, we obviously have a duty to protect what we see, because it, that, like, going to go see a movie like that, we should know is wrong, right? Because it's not showing the dignity of a human person. It's not that it's showing too much of them, but it's showing too little. I believe that's what Archbishop Fulton Sheen used to say about pornography.
Yeah, that's exactly what he would say. And I think for me too, it's really just this kind of sense of, it presents a really false idea of sexuality, and that's the thing. I think what happens is maybe people, read these kind of books or watch movies like this because maybe that's their expectation of sexuality, either in their relationships or in their marriages even. And because of that, it's now like transforming the way they think about it to the point where it causes problems in their actual relationships and their marriages. That's what we say. Pornography kills love. It really, really does. And I think that's a huge topic of like any kind of medium, anything to do with media, is if it has some kind of portrayal of sexuality, it's almost always wrong. It's almost as this. It's very manipulative. It's very utilitarian, and so it's almost never portrayed as God intended to be portrayed.
Especially since I think a lot of the times, like, what we see can affect our worldview, right? So if we are filling our heads with junk and horror movies that aren't very good. I mean, what was that movie just came out last year on Good Friday, Unholy, which was a complete blasphemous movie about Our Lady and her apparitions. It was completely demonic, and Hollywood knew what it was doing. And so that could have an effect on people if they went to go see it who are Christian. I mean, why would you go see that if you're Christian? But in general, what we watch and what we see have a power to control how we see the world. It can control our worldview. And so if we're viewing those kinds of images, we won't respect people. If you view pornography, it's proven that you see people as objects. And so it alters your brain and the way you start to treat people. And it also alters how you can connect to people, because what happens is your brain basically gets stimulated and you connect with a screen. You're connecting with pixels, and you do that over and over and over and over again until eventually you can't make any connections at all. And unfortunately, our brains are wired in such a way where we become addicted to those hormones that are released in our heads. And unfortunately, our culture just likes to push it more and more, because they know the more sexual they can push something, the more people get addicted to that, the more they destroy the nuclear family.
Yep. And I think, there's it's almost not even like subtle anymore. It seems like people try to add, just for the sake of getting people to watch a particular movie or show, that they'll sexualize something in there. Like I remember, like there was a point, like with like a lot of movies on like the Sci-Fi Channel, the monster movies, that they'd have like this like sex scene or something like just thrown in there.
Game of Thrones, that's a big one.
Like, because I've never seen Game of Thrones, so I
Me
can't.
neither.
But like, like they'll just like throw these things in there just for the sake of having some kind of sexual content as I'll use a fishing analogy because I love fishing, as your bait, as your lure.
Well, that is a tactic that Hollywood uses, during the drive-in cinema era of film, which was the mid to late 60s probably into the mid 70s. In the Midwest, the Southeast, any part of the country where there was land, we had drive-ins. In the big cities, you had grindhouse theaters, which were old burlesque theaters that were shut down to basically show the same type of stuff. So it was martial arts films, it was exploitation films, all types. And Crown International Pictures, which was one of the biggest makers of films in that era, some of these B movie companies that made drive-in cinema films would put out more films than big movie studios would. But they always had very specific things they wanted. Like, for instance, Crown International wanted nudity in the first 8 minutes of the movie. So every movie that Crown International made, there was always going to be a nude scene between about 6 to 8 minutes in. Every one of them were all like that. Sci-Fi Channel, who I worked for a long time, their thing was they would make these movies cheap. These monster movies would be made cheap in Bulgaria and Prague. But they would heavily edit them down for American television. But because Sci-Fi Channel was in a lot of other countries, most of those countries were very liberal when it came to nudity on television. So language nudity, maybe even more violence, was included in those. So there's certainly definitely mandates on how entertainment is made, and even today, and how things are made for app-based entertainment, streaming services. There's very specific things that people want, and there's rules. They set rules, corporate rules.
Yeah, and that's something I kind of wanted to talk about as well. You just mentioned like streaming services. That's something I'm noticing more and more lately. That's becoming a very stealthy danger. And if you ask me, like Disney Plus lately, I'm gonna call them out. Disney Plus has really been like the F-22 Raptor of the entertainment industry. I say that because the F-22 Raptor is the stealthiest airplane that's ever flown. And its whole point is to fly in. Exactly. Oh yeah, you're right. That we know of. But its whole premise is to fly in undetected and wreak as much havoc as possible, And so like that's what Disney Plus. I remember when Disney Plus came out, a couple of years ago, and I sat down and I watched High School Musical because I grew up with that, and then I watched like the first season of High School Musical, the musical, and I was like, oh my gosh, like kids are being fed this, and like you have all kind of like new age stuff and just things that are just totally contrary to church teaching, and I'm like, if you're a parent who downloaded Disney Plus and thought that, oh, my kid can just watch whatever's on here, it's Disney, it's supposed to be child friendly, and if you just let the iPad babysit your child, you have no idea that they're being fed some of the stuff. And that was rather alarming for me. And that's what we're seeing on a lot of streaming platforms is, a lot of TV shows. I know there was a, Amber, you probably know more about this. Recently, the movie, was it called Turning Red? Well, I didn't see it, but like, yeah, but like, that's kind of the same premise of like, it looks like a kid's film. And then it goes into things like, is this really age appropriate?
It was
and
not.
Like the laws in Florida kind of coming in like this, the law that people are having a problem with, where it's like, we shouldn't be teaching like sex ed to kindergartners. Like, for crying out loud, like we are sexualizing children as a society. And a lot of that's coming through the media.
Yeah.
Disney Plus is also adding an adult option for their service, which is in its testing phase right now. So it will be Disney Plus. I think what the working title of it right now is Star. So I think it'll be Disney Star. Disney Star will be all the R-rated entries that they have, because when Disney, a lot of people don't realize, but Buena Vista Home Video would put out anything that was PG-13 or R-rated stuff. This, that was common all through the VHS era. But Disney stuff was always the animations, a lot of their family entertainment was always G-rated. But now that Disney is a mega super huge company, they've absorbed so many other production houses that they have all of 20th Century Fox's entertainment now, all the Fox TV stuff, and they need an outlet to put all the R-rated movies out, or shows like Glee, things like that would be questionable. So now there will be an add-on service to Disney Plus that will give much more mature entertainment, which hopefully will be, there'll be a way for parents to guard their kids from being able to see that, or whether it's part of the service, I don't know.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see. So I do want to talk about video games too, because that's something that's very prevalent for me. And it's funny because I actually use video games in my preaching quite a bit. It's a funny thing. I'm kind of known for that, especially with my kids at my cathedral school. They know that anytime we have school mass, I'm probably going to find a way to incorporate video games. But what's been amazing is their ability to remember what's said in the homily. Because I'll relate certain principles of life to video games. Like, it was funny, the other day, we had the gospel reading of the Transfiguration. It was one of the Sundays of Lent. And so I talked about prop hunt on Fortnite. it was brilliant. And because I thought about it, I was like, how can I maybe talk about like, especially like kid appropriate stuff, I was like, oh my gosh, like the whole concept of like prop hunt is you transfigure into a prop on the map and you play hide and seek, and you can't trust what you see. You have to trust more of what you hear. And that's what happened with Peter, like at the transfiguration, was that, he's so caught up in what he sees that he forgets the voice of the Father who says, this is my beloved son, listen to him. So like, I love using video game references in my homilies. Now, I find with video games, what tends to happen is there tends to be two extremes. There's the extreme that people think, oh, it's just like Mario and Tetris and things like that. And then you have people on the other hand who are like, video games are evil. They shouldn't be allowed. Like, they're just completely bad in and of themselves. And I think what's happening is the church is starting to see, like, we can't treat it as that. We can't treat it as this, like, extreme evil. Because there are good things about video games, and people are actually learning kind of good moral lessons in some ways with video games. It's taking up a lot of people's time. I will say that. I think there's a point where we really have to exercise the virtue of temperance. But I find with video games, people are looking for transcendentals of being. People are looking for things like goodness, beauty, maybe to a kind of, maybe not to say lesser extent, but almost like the subconscious extent of truth. And it was interesting because, like, on the episode I was watching of God and Gaming, they were talking about this, how you have some men who, because, and maybe Amber, this is why I really want to talk to you about this as well, that you have like the sense of like neo-feminism that has like diminished masculinity to such an extent that men are actually using video games as an outlet to explore masculine virtues, such as being able to defend somebody. That's why you see some men playing what we call FPS games, first-person shooters, Call of Duty, things like that, because it's mission-oriented. It gives them the sense of purpose and also the sense of, I have to protect my teammate. So Amber, you have like any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think back, like, I mean, speaking from our heritage and things like that, our ancestors all came from rough pasts. We all have ancestors that lived through the Black Plague. We've all had ancestors that have lived through World War I, World War II. And so back then, it was really important for men to know their duty and to prove themselves as men, to be able to fight for their country, to fight for their families, even before the wars, even before we had cities and towns and things. Like, when you were in a small community, men still went out and hunted together in a pack, to bring home food for the family. They need that sense of purpose. Going to a 9-to-5 job does not fulfill that purpose for men. Not to say that, it's not beneficial, because of course you're providing in a way that you can now in the modern world, right? But it's no wonder to me that men are addicted to video games, due to the fact that it gives them that sense of purpose. But in reality, some other senses of purpose that can, if they wanted to take up a hobby like fishing, or they could even start moving their family off grid. I'm not saying like that's the best thing to do, but you could start homesteading. You could start moving your way towards, trying to be more efficient in that way. But I don't think it's always plausible, especially in the modern world we live in. I mean, not to say that I watch TLC, but sometimes on TLC, there's videos of families who go off grid. Well, not completely, of course, because they're on TLC, but they're starting homesteading or something. And the men love it. They throw off their suits, they put on a t-shirt, they put on jeans, and they grab an axe and they start hacking away at firewood. They've never done this before, but oh my gosh, it's like firewood was their purpose. They just love the hands-on hard work. Men really do love hard work. And I think the generation my generation and younger generations are lacking hard work, because everything's basically been given to us. A lot of us have had to work hard, of course, in different areas. But when it comes to manual labor, I mean, for the most part, like, you can buy chopped wood at the gas station. You can buy meat at the grocery store. I don't know if this is making any sense.
No, it is. It is. There's a book, and I'm trying to remember who the author is. He was an Army veteran, but the book is called On Killing. And what the book kind of goes into is the fact that when you look at kind of, things that like people, but like specifically like men have had to do for thousands of years, to an extent is diminished because of, especially I think because of like American production, if you want to call it that, this kind of worship of being productive. You look at things like putting food on the table. You used to actually have to go gather it or hunt the animal, kill the animal yourself, know how to slaughter the animal so where you could actually carve it up and eat the parts you can actually eat. Whereas most people, like hardly anyone, except, if as a family, like if that's your business, is like a butcher shop, like there's a very famous butcher here in my area, but it's run by a family. Other than that one family, like if you're not a hunting family or an outdoorsy family, most people don't actually kill and prepare their own food.
Survival of the fittest. It'll be like natural selection.
Which is why I like that I live in the South, because I grew up hunting and fishing. And so I think we'll be fine down here, Yeah, I think rednecks are going to be like the last people on the face of the earth after World War III.
We'll come visit Father Dan.
I'll teach you how to kill an alligator down here,
Ooh, delicious.
It really is. Tastes like chicken if you fry it right.
I can make myself a new purse or something too. Why not?
Yeah.
No,
but I was really just kind of intrigued by the video series, and I really encourage people to go check that out. Again, it's like a 6-part episodes on YouTube, and it's called God and Gaming, and it's a discussion between Bobby Angel and a friend of his. I can't remember the priest's name right now, but the priest himself is a huge gamer, and he kind of goes into like all the details of like the different types of gaming and how it really helps us, even like with thinking about the world around us too. Like he talks about how like I mentioned FPS games, first-person shooters, they're very linear. And then you have games like RPGs, role-playing games that are very, I guess, more explorative. Like the whole idea is like they're much bigger worlds. They're not as linear. You get to explore more. And it was really funny. And I'm going to actually use like from my childhood. For the listeners who don't know, I actually have a twin brother. And so my brother and I, we played video games since we were probably in 3rd grade. But we liked different games. Like I liked the first-person shooters, and my brother liked the RPGs. So like I would play like Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, things like that. My brother would play like the Kingdom Hearts games, Final Fantasy. And it's because we're actually very different people. And I've noticed that as we've gotten older. My brother is a lot more kind of circular in his thinking. Matt is very much like the more artistic person. He's got the more artsy brain. So for him, like exploring things, taking the time to kind of get into all the details of the world, really getting the fullest experience of the world around him. That's my brother. Whereas I'm very linear. I'm a very linear thinker. I'm very goal oriented. Like that's why I like a lot of these first person shooter games, because they're mission oriented, and I'm very much about missions and goals. But then also like I don't like going in circles. And it's funny, I thought about this as well in the seminary. I always preferred reading Pope Benedict's writings because he's very linear. And I had a hard time reading John Paul II. And I love what John Paul II writes. It's just, if you sit down and actually read his Theology of the Body Catechesis, he's very circular. Like you can see how he kind of comes back to things over and over again before at the end of the chapter, he finally gets to the point that he was trying to get to. And that drives me bananas. It really, really does. Whereas Pope Benedict will very methodically walk you through something. And this is why I like reading Thomas Aquinas as opposed to Augustine. Augustine is very circular as well. Whereas Aquinas, his Summa Theologia is set up very linearly. It's very direct. And so I think it's funny, as this priest was talking about different types of video games, it really appeals to different mindsets, which I think is really cool to explore as well, in terms of, are you the kind of person, who likes the RPG games because you like the exploration, you like taking the time to really invest in your character development or things, or are you more linear and you like the sake of like accomplishing a goal, So I thought that was a really interesting point with video games I never even really thought of.
I think it also depends, because that says something about left-brained and right-brained people. Like I'm definitely a right-brained person. So I'm like a circle person, but it depends on what I'm talking about. If the topic isn't something I'm actually interested in, the circling will like drive me crazy. And I'm like, can we just get to the point? But if it's something I'm actually interested in, I'm like, no, keep going, keep going. Like I need to hear it again. So it definitely has something to say for left versus right-brained people for sure.
Yep. It was a really good series. I really encourage the listeners to go check that out. And one of the things too is that they're acknowledging also the fact that this has become such a large demographic of people. They said in the first episode, 75% of American households have at least one person playing video games. That's the majority of the country. Somebody in the household is playing video games. And they said the average age of gamers is actually between something like 35 to 40-year-olds. And that's because the age range is so great. You have a lot of young people playing video games, and you have a lot of, I say, relatively older people playing video games. I remember playing Ace Combat a while back and playing multiplayer on Ace Combat. And one of the guys in my gaming group, I want to say, was in his 60s or 70s.
Well,
here he is playing Ace, yeah.
The average 50-year-old grew up playing Pong. So the 50-year-old has been around since the birth of video games in the 70s. So those guys have lived through the arcades that were at the mall. They've lived through the Ataris, the very first home consoles, the Nintendo generation. They've lived through all those systems. So that's why there's older people that play video games. I have a little bit more of a slant on this. I've been listening to you all talk about video games, and I've been, thinking to myself, what value comes from something like Candy Crush, aside from making yourself an addiction? I would be a hypocrite if I didn't say that I played video games growing up, because I did. And I enjoy all kinds of video games, but I feel the video games are very dangerous. And I think, like Hollywood, it's a very dangerous. And the reason why is because all of this is a system of control, and it's a system of programming, and it's a system of desensitizing people. And I think that that's incredibly dangerous precedent to set. And entertainment has always been used as a method of propaganda for a long time. There's always an agenda within a studio system, is with the type of content they make or the way in which they perceive the world. I read an article today that was an interview with Pat Boone. Now, Amber won't have any idea who Pat Boone is, but Pat Boone is
I don't even know who that is.
Pat
You gotta remember, I'm not that much older than Amber.
Pat Boone is he's in his 80s now, but he is a movie star from way back, and he's always maintained his Christian values, and so is his family. So Pat Boone is very famous in Hollywood for doing things like turning down movies with Marilyn Monroe because she was too sexualized. And he had an interesting thing that he said in his interview, and he talked about how American cinema has changed, and the portrayal of Americans isn't what it used to be. And he feels that it's detrimental to our society with how cinema is portraying America now. But that's what Hollywood has always done. It's created an agenda. And you have to remember that, and this isn't, I'm not saying this to be disparaging to anyone, but Hollywood is run by two factions. It's run by the Jewish, and it's run by the Scientologists. Catholics aren't in high positions in movie studios. So agendas are created within a studio system and entertainment system to project a certain type of entertainment and how they want the world to be seen, and whatever that agenda needs to be. But in particular with things like video games, it used to be when Columbine happened, those school shooters, I mean, that was really the first famous school shooting that happened, sort of this notorious event. And those kids were bullied mercilessly, and they were fans of certain movies like The Matrix, and they were playing video games. And the first thing kind of the Christian world came out to say was, oh, this influenced them. This made them go in and be killers. They dressed like characters from movies. They had certain types of first-person shooter video games in their homes. And that was the jump that was made, the leap. Now, those kids are dead. So, we'll never know from them what influenced them to do it. But there could be some credibility in that these types of things have influenced you. You see a lot of gunplay in films. The kids have grown up, generations of kids have grown up seeing so much gunplay in film and television that the idea of a gun being dangerous doesn't register to them anymore. And especially when you play a first-person shooter, when you play a Call of Duty and you're operating in a system in which that gun is in your hand on a screen right in front of you, or whatever method you're viewing it in, can desensitize you. Is there some weight to what I'm saying here, Father Dan?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a danger in this stuff.
Yes, and that's another point, going back to that book on killing. that the author says is that, especially like with modern video games, they're using the same tactics that the military uses to, in a sense, desensitize your soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, all these people, to be able to actually pull the trigger when they need to. So in a sense, there is a correlation there. At the same time, it's not to say it's a complete non sequitur. I think there's a sense in which, like, for certain people, it can lead to a grave desensitization of human life. You know, at the same time, when you look at how many video gamers there are in the world, as opposed to the number of people who commit shootings, I think that the number of video gamers is so high that it can't be considered that great of a factor. In, you know, it's a factor for some people, but not for really, I think that's a slim minority of people who it's that influential for. Again, yeah, it's a lot of this is discretion. A lot of this to me is the home life. And this is the thing too. This is where, you know, media really has to become family oriented again. I think that's what's really been a lot of root causes as regards, you know, the evils committed by media, is the fact that it has gone so unchecked in family life. Because like for me, like, you know, I've played first person shooters growing up all the time, and for me, like, it never once crossed my mind, you know. But that's because, like, I was raised in a family where right and wrong was very clear. The moral compass was always very, very clear. And I remember, like, you know, the first time I ever played paintball at a friend's birthday party, you know, when I was in like middle school, I was terrified. And I'd played video games before, but for me, like, I was so terrified of like just being kind of like in the ring holding a paintball gun, and the fact that somebody else was shooting at me, you know. So in a sense, like, even video games can't replace the sense of realism that, like, oh my gosh, somebody else is actually shooting at me. And I think, like, that's the connection that still needs to happen with reality, as opposed to, you know, if someone lives completely in a virtual world. And again, this is where virtue is extremely important, temperance when it comes to video games. There's a lot of great lessons to be learned. At the same time, it is very, very alarming to me the amount of time that is spent by a lot of people in video games. And that's what you see like the YouTube videos all the time of kids who are spending all day in the video games. Mom and dad come in and just absolutely destroy their gaming consoles because that's all they're doing. Again, there has to be a virtuous balance. But at the same time, you know, yeah, too much of it will definitely cause a lot of the problems that we're seeing with these correlations.
Grand Theft Auto is a great example, because you have to wonder, is there any redeeming value at all?
Yeah,
from a game
that one
like
I'm
that?
not sure, because that whole
game is an evil game created by an evil company to do nothing but create chaos.
Exactly. That's something I don't like that at all. I really
it's
don't.
stealing,
Yeah.
it's robbery, it's carjacking, it's rape, it's all of the worst stuff you can put in a game in one of the most popular video game series of all time.
Yeah, I don't agree with that at all. Again, that's kind of one of those cases where we have to look at and say, this is kind of like Grand Theft Auto, if you ask me, is basically the 50 Shades of Grey of, like, you know, movie and books. It's one of those things like that, like, there should be no reason as to why this is even in a video game. You know, that's the thing, you do have to look at, is there any positivity involved in a game like that? Is there anything, any kind of lesson other than that, like, oh my gosh, this could actually happen to me, and maybe I should go take taekwondo lessons, you know? So, not to make light of the situation, but, like, that's, you know, again, like, how many people are going to go down that route and think, you know, no, like, for a video game like that, its purpose is to have, I guess, more or less a safe space to just be as sinful as possible in a video game.
I want to get your guys' opinion on a video game that I was obsessed with, and sometimes still am, once a month. Okay, or once every couple months. The Sims.
I've never played The Sims.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Todd?
I'm familiar with The Sims. I never played it, though.
You don't have, like, a little Todd Sim running around Sim City? No. Or any?
My only familiarity is there's a hilarious YouTube video of an update to Sims, and they had so many, like, crazy rule changes that, like, you can't be, like, on fire in an elevator or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, you know, stupid stuff like that. That's my only familiarity with The Sims.
I'm gonna make you guys Sims now. I'm just kidding. I'll do it later.
Oh man, I mean, is it kind of like Minecraft? I mean,
so it's basically like you control people's
Roblox.
lives. Like you make them do things and you make them like interact with each other and get jobs or get murdered or die. I drown them in swimming pools sometimes, especially if they're ugly.
Oh my gosh, what is wrong with you?
Everything apparently. Okay, ask any sim player. Everybody has done it at least once.
I miss the old days when my parents would just
statement to hear.
I miss the old days when my parents just complained about me playing Dungeons and Dragons in the garage.
Yeah, that's not.
I can't help it.
Well, the next evolution of all of this is going into the metaverse. So
yeah,
everything gets merged in that if this actually happens. So,
our brains become computers and all that fun stuff. And
so I hope the Catholic Church is getting themselves set up for the metaverse so people will be able to go into their virtual reality environment and still be able to go to church, because they're not going to want to leave their house to go to a real one.
I have a feeling Bishop Robert Barron is already contemplating what the church's stance on that's all going to be, because that's very much his kind of emphasis is on like the direction the church is going, with technology and culture, and how does the church address these issues. I very much suspect that the next time we have like a Vatican Council, like I imagine Vatican III is probably going to be sooner than we expect. Or I would say maybe sooner rather than later, because that's the thing. It seems like that society, culture, and technology has been changing at a much higher rate exponentially than it had in the previous, like 2,000-year history of the church, that we're going to constantly have to be reevaluating exactly where the church stands in so many issues. I feel like in the last decade of, that I spent mostly in the seminary, that was like living under a rock, because like, you go to school in the seminary, yet you have the same routine. Nothing changes around you for 7 years. And then you get back out in the real world and you have so many culture changes. And it was a really shocking, for me to, once I got ordained a priest, it was like living back full time at home to see, oh my gosh, like everything's changing culturally, society, technologically. And so I think, the church is going to have to really continue that, probably in a more fluid way than it has in the past, and it can't just be every couple of decades. Like we're constantly having to reevaluate as new issues and new topics come up. How is the church going to address this? But again, that all comes back to our principles. That comes back to many truths that we know. And this is, I think for us, the foundation is always going back to the truths we know will never change. If we go back to the sense of immutable truths, because that's the thing, God is unchanging. And so for us to go back to those truths that do not change, that's our foundation. That's what's going to give us what we need to go into as situations change into the future, to help us address the situations that, obviously will be changing. So yeah, I think unchanging truth is super important as we look at where media is really taking us.
I'm not so sure we'll be waiting for Vatican III as much as that second coming might be happening a lot sooner than we think.
Yeah. Place your bets on which one's first.
Maybe we'll get both at the same time.
Oh my, that would be funny.
So
Amber, we got to start setting up the religious hippie in the metaverse just to make sure you're covered there.
What is that?
What is the metaverse?
Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead and explain that for us? Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's another podcast episode.
Great. We'll do that in 2 weeks.
Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah. Will there be church in the metaverse?
Sounds good.
With our guest Mark Zuckerberg to answer that question for us.
That sounds interesting. So, but hey guys, it was great having y'all on here today. And y'all want to go ahead and plug in y'all social media for our listeners?
Well, everyone can find me is Metatomic Todd. I'm out there all over social media, but my podcast is in hiatus right now. I just finished season 3, so I don't need to plug that right now.
Cool.
I'm basically on everything except for TikTok, because TikTok is salty and it banned me. But I am on basically everything. And
as the religious hippie.
Yeah. Can I tell them about the website?
Sure.
Okay. So we are also.
There's a website?
There's a website.
Oh my gosh.
No. I'm so excited. So Todd and I have been working really hard, mostly Todd, on my website. And I'm very excited to announce that I have a website, and it's going to be The Religious Hippie.
It should be up live by the time this episode airs.
Yeah, I'm very excited for it. And besides that, I'm on all other social media. I have a podcast, The Catholic's Perspective with the Religious Hippie. I'm on YouTube, and I have Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
Sweet. And Amber just released another video, I think episode 4 or 2, because you kind of use it as a replacement episode, on like, especially like this topic we talked about today, like with media and, the Catholic perspectives and all that. So, but as always, it was great having both of you on here. And so that will conclude our time for today. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next time. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Karate Priest. If you enjoyed this podcast, go ahead and like The Karate Priest on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're ever in South Louisiana, come visit me at the Cathedral of St. Francis de Sales in Houma. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can also email me at thekaratepriest@gmail.com. Your questions are welcomed and may be used in future episodes. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down on you and remain with you forever. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fischer and distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for the International Association of Metatomics at metatomics.org, or find us on social media for other unique content.